There are actors who spend their entire careers chasing one perfect role. And then there are actors who spend the rest of their lives trying to step out of its shadow. Tom Welling belongs to the second group. For millions of people around the world, he will always be Clark Kent. Not the Superman who flies above Metropolis in a bright blue suit, but the young man who wasn't quite sure who he was yet. A farm boy carrying impossible expectations. Someone trying to understand where he belonged before he ever thought about saving the world. That's probably why Smallville connected with an entire generation. It was never really about Superman. It was about growing up. And Tom Welling somehow became the face of that journey. The strange thing is, he almost never became an actor at all. Unlike many Hollywood stars, Welling wasn't the kid performing for relatives at family gatherings. He wasn't dreaming about Academy Awards or memorizing movie monologues in front of a mirror. In fact, by his own admission, acting wasn't part of the plan. If life had unfolded a little differently, we might never have known his name. Instead, one unexpected decision and a remarkable amount of reluctance led him toward one of television's most iconic roles. But that same role would also become both his greatest triumph and his biggest challenge. Because once audiences see you as Superman, convincing them you're anyone else becomes almost impossible. Today we're exploring the remarkable story of Tom Welling, how a former construction worker and model became one of television's most recognizable faces, why Smallville turned into far more than just another superhero series, why Hollywood never quite knew what to do with him afterward, and why, years later, Tom Welling seems happier than ever, even though he quietly walked away from the kind of fame most actors spend their lives pursuing. Because this isn't simply the story of an actor. It's the story of someone who discovered that success and happiness aren't always the same thing. Tom Welling was born on April 26, 1977, in Putnam Valley, New York, before spending much of his childhood moving around the United States with his family because of his father's work. Eventually, they settled in Michigan, where Welling grew up leading what could only be described as an ordinary American life. There were no movie sets, no celebrity neighbors, no famous acting schools. Instead, there were school sports, family routines, and the kind of quiet suburban upbringing that rarely produces Hollywood stars. If anything stood out about young Tom, it wasn't theater, it was athletics. He loved basketball, baseball, football, and soccer. Competition came naturally to him, and for a long time, sports seemed like a much more realistic future than acting. Looking back, it's easy to see why audiences later believed him as Clark Kent. He never carried himself like someone desperate to be noticed. There was an authenticity about him, a grounded quality that's surprisingly difficult to fake on camera.
And are you ready for what might happen next?
I don't know. Day by day. Yeah.
Ironically, that same authenticity almost kept him out of Hollywood altogether. After graduating from high school, Welling worked ordinary jobs, including construction. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him something many young actors never experience: life outside the entertainment industry. He understood early mornings, physical labor, and the satisfaction of finishing a hard day's work. Those experiences stayed with him. Even years later, after becoming famous, there was always something refreshingly unpolished about him. He looked like a movie star. He behaved like the guy next door. Eventually, modeling agencies began noticing what everyone else had probably noticed for years. Standing over 6 feet tall, with striking features and an easy confidence, Welling fit perfectly into the fashion industry's image of the all-American leading man. He initially resisted. Friends have since joked that he had to be persuaded more than once before taking modeling seriously. That reluctance says something important. Most aspiring actors spend years trying to get Hollywood's attention. Tom Welling had Hollywood knocking on his door and wasn't particularly interested in answering. That would become a recurring theme throughout his career. He never seemed obsessed with fame. He was interested in the work, but not necessarily everything that came with it. Modeling eventually brought him to Los Angeles, almost by accident, and once he arrived, another unexpected opportunity appeared: television.
I moved out to LA to, give acting 110%, give it a shot. And 6 months later, I landed a role on a show called Judging Amy.
Not because he'd spent years auditioning, not because he'd carefully planned every step, simply because people saw something on screen that cameras loved. It wasn't just his appearance. There was a calmness, a natural stillness. The camera wasn't chasing him, it seemed to settle around him. Sometimes the biggest careers don't begin with relentless ambition. Sometimes they begin because someone else notices something you haven't yet recognized in yourself. For Tom Welling, that realization was only just beginning. And before long, a television pilot about a young Clark Kent would change his life forever. The role that changed everything. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, television looked very different. Superhero stories were still considered risky. Comic book adaptations hadn't yet become Hollywood's safest investment, and the idea of building an entire series around Clark Kent before he became Superman sounded, at best, unconventional. The audience already knew how the story would end. The challenge wasn't showing Superman, it was making people care about the years before he became Superman. That required something much harder than spectacular visual effects. It required an actor capable of making Clark Kent feel like a real person, not an icon, not a symbol, a teenager. Tom Welling wasn't the obvious choice. He had very little acting experience compared to many other candidates. His resume was remarkably short, and even he wasn't convinced he wanted the role.
Rob Meltzer, Lauren Sensei.
Yeah, Amy Gray. I think I met you when I signed Lauren up.
According to Welling himself, he initially turned down auditions more than once because he wasn't actively pursuing a television career. Ironically, that hesitation may have been exactly what made him perfect. Clark Kent isn't someone chasing greatness, he's someone trying to avoid it. That emotional conflict became the foundation of Smallville. When the series premiered in October 2001, audiences immediately noticed something unusual. Unlike previous versions of Superman, this Clark wasn't defined by confidence. He was defined by uncertainty. Every episode asked essentially the same question in a different way. How do you become yourself when everyone expects you to become someone else? Looking back, it's remarkable how rarely Smallville was actually about saving the world. Instead, it explored friendship, first love, loneliness, family expectations, responsibility, betrayal, and identity. Superpowers were often just metaphors. The real conflict was always emotional. Tom Welling understood that instinctively. He never played Clark as someone who secretly wanted to become Superman. He made Clark smaller, quieter, more vulnerable. He listened more than he spoke. He hesitated before making decisions. He looked genuinely uncomfortable with attention. Those choices made Clark surprisingly relatable. Almost everyone has experienced moments of feeling different from the people around them. Almost everyone has wondered whether they belong. That's why Smallville connected with audiences far beyond comic book fans. It wasn't really telling the story of Superman, it was telling the story of becoming an adult. As Smallville continued, something unexpected happened. It stopped being a niche superhero series and became one of television's defining dramas of the 2000s. Running for 10 seasons and more than 200 episodes, it became one of the longest-running science fiction series in American television history. Beginning with later seasons, Welling became an executive producer, taking a much more active role in shaping the direction of the series. He wasn't simply showing up to perform his scenes anymore. He became involved in larger creative decisions, helping guide the show's evolution as Clark moved closer to becoming Superman. That transition revealed something important about him. Unlike many actors satisfied with staying in front of the camera, Welling wanted to understand how stories were built. It suggested that his interests extended beyond acting itself. By this point, Smallville had become much more than another successful television series. For an entire generation, it became their first introduction to Superman. Christopher Reeve had inspired one era, Henry Cavill would inspire another. But between them stood Tom Welling, the Clark Kent audiences watched grow up over an entire decade. That's a different kind of connection. In many ways, fans weren't simply watching Clark mature, they were growing up alongside him. That's one of the reasons the emotional bond between Smallville and its audience remains unusually strong even today. Hollywood has always struggled to separate actors from legendary roles. Christopher Reeve carried Superman with him for the rest of his career. Mark Hamill will forever be Luke Skywalker. Daniel Radcliffe spent years proving he was more than Harry Potter. Tom Welling faced the same challenge, except his version lasted an entire decade. By the time Smallville ended in 2011, audiences didn't just associate him with Clark Kent. For many viewers, he was Clark Kent. And while that's an extraordinary compliment, it can also become an invisible cage. Casting directors don't simply see talent, they see recognition. The more unforgettable the role, the harder it becomes to imagine the actor as someone else. It's one of Hollywood's strangest paradoxes. Sometimes your greatest success becomes the biggest obstacle to your next chapter. For Tom Welling, that chapter was about to begin. Life after Smallville. When Smallville aired its final episode in May 2011, the television landscape looked completely different from the one it had entered a decade earlier. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was gaining momentum. Streaming services were beginning to reshape the industry. Superheroes were no longer considered a niche genre. They were becoming Hollywood's biggest business. Ironically, Tom Welling helped open that door. But unlike many actors who ride the biggest wave available, he quietly stepped away. He was choosing quality of life over constant visibility. That's an important distinction. Hollywood often teaches actors to fear disappearing. Tom Welling never seemed particularly afraid of it. One of the biggest misconceptions about actors who finish a hugely successful television series is that every door immediately opens for them. The truth is often much more complicated. When audiences spend 10 years watching the same face every week, separating the performer from the character becomes incredibly difficult. Audiences build emotional relationships with characters. Breaking those relationships takes time. Rather than fighting that reality, Welling approached his next chapter with patience. He accepted smaller projects, different genres, different audiences. It wasn't the explosive reinvention many expected. It was something quieter. One of his most notable post-Smallville performances came in Parkland, 2013, where he portrayed Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman during the chaotic aftermath of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. This wasn't the kind of role designed to make headlines. There were no superpowers, no dramatic speeches, no larger-than-life heroics. Instead, Welling played a man caught inside one of the most traumatic days in American history.
The hell with you, and the hell with your law.
Move it out! You understand?
Screw the lid on that coffin now!
Kellerman isn't trying to command attention. He's trying to survive overwhelming circumstances while carrying the crushing responsibility of his position. It reminded critics that Welling possessed something often overlooked in modern acting. He knew how to be still. In an era where many performances compete for attention, stillness can be surprisingly powerful. Over the following years, Welling continued choosing projects that looked nothing like Clark Kent. His role as Lieutenant Marcus Pierce in Lucifer was particularly interesting. At first glance, Pierce appears calm, disciplined, and dependable. But beneath that composed exterior lies centuries of emotional exhaustion and moral conflict. If that sounds familiar, there's a reason. Throughout his career, Welling has often been drawn to characters carrying invisible burdens. Clark Kent hid extraordinary abilities. Marcus Pierce hid immortality. The circumstances changed. The emotional architecture remained remarkably similar. But this time, there was an important difference. Welling wasn't playing an optimistic young man discovering himself. He was playing someone who had already lived far too long. It was almost the inverse of Clark Kent. Instead of wondering what the future might bring, Pierce wondered whether the future was worth enduring at all. Those are the kinds of choices that rarely dominate entertainment headlines, but they reveal an actor trying to expand rather than repeat himself. The man who never chased Hollywood. There's an interesting moment that happens in almost every long-running acting career. Eventually, the question changes. Early on, people ask, can this actor become a star? Years later, the question becomes, can this actor escape the role that made them famous? But with Tom Welling, I think we've been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe he never wanted to escape Clark Kent. Maybe he simply wanted to grow beyond him. Those aren't the same thing. Because despite all the conversations about typecasting, Welling has never spoken about Smallville with bitterness. If anything, the years have made him more appreciative of what the series meant, not just for his own career, but for millions of fans who grew up alongside it. That's a subtle but important distinction. Some actors spend decades trying to distance themselves from the role that made them famous. Tom Welling seems to have made peace with it. And perhaps that's why audiences have made peace with him as well. Returning to Smallville. For years after Smallville ended, fans dreamed about seeing Tom Welling wear the Superman suit. The show's producers had deliberately avoided it for almost its entire run. The famous "no tights, no flights" philosophy wasn't just a marketing slogan, it became part of the show's identity. Smallville wasn't about Superman, it was about becoming Superman. And because of that, many viewers felt there was still one final chapter missing. In 2019, Welling surprised fans by returning as Clark Kent during the Arrowverse Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover. It wasn't a traditional comeback. There were no epic battles, no dramatic rescue scenes. Instead, audiences found something far more unexpected. Clark had given up his Kryptonian powers. He was married to Lois Lane. He had children. He was living quietly on the Kent farm. For some fans, it was controversial. For many others, it felt completely right. Because after 10 seasons of watching Clark struggle to build a normal life, seeing him finally achieve it felt like the ending Smallville had always been moving toward. The crossover lasted only a few minutes, yet those few minutes carried the emotional weight of an entire decade. Sometimes closure doesn't require spectacle. Sometimes it only requires seeing someone at peace. Life beyond the camera. Away from Hollywood, Welling has built a life that looks remarkably ordinary considering the extraordinary career he's had. He married Jessica Rose Lee in 2019, and together they have 2 sons. Unlike many celebrities, he rarely puts his private life at the center of public attention. Instead, interviews often reveal someone who seems genuinely happiest talking about family, friends, storytelling, and the creative process, rather than celebrity itself. In recent years, he's also reconnected with the Smallville community through fan conventions and, alongside former co-star Michael Rosenbaum, the podcast Talkville. The podcast has become something special. It's not just a nostalgic rewatch. It's an honest conversation between 2 people looking back at one of television's defining series with the benefit of time. Sometimes they laugh about behind-the-scenes memories. Sometimes they admit episodes that didn't work. Sometimes they discover details they'd forgotten entirely. It's less about reliving the past, and more about understanding it. That honesty is probably why fans embraced it so quickly.
When is the last time you watched an episode of Smallville, Tom?
I mean, I don't even, probably forever.
Hollywood often celebrates transformation, bigger roles, bigger franchises, bigger fame. But Welling's story suggests a different definition of success. He didn't become the biggest movie star in the world. He didn't spend the next 20 years chasing the spotlight. Instead, he built something far more difficult to manufacture: trust. For 10 years, audiences believed him. They believed his uncertainty, his kindness, his loneliness, his hope. Clark Kent wasn't inspiring because he was invincible. He was inspiring because he doubted himself and kept moving forward anyway. In many ways, Tom Welling did the same. He never tried to outrun Smallville. He never tried to erase Clark Kent from his story. He simply kept writing new chapters. And perhaps that's the most fitting ending imaginable. Tom Welling became unforgettable because for millions of people, he made one of the world's greatest heroes feel wonderfully, reassuringly human.